Hello students, good day to all of you. So in this neuroanatomy lecture series, now we are actually passing on to the third lecture, that is the Medulla Oblongata. So our learning objectives for today will be with respect to Medulla Oblongata. So a brief introduction about the brainstem, followed by that then we will actually discuss the brainstem external features, and then followed by that in detail we are going to actually discuss about the internal features of brainstem, which will be through the sections at the various levels. Then followed by that we will be actually discussing the arteries supplying the medulla, okay, and then the followed by that the clinical aspects. Now first of all, the medulla oblongata is actually part of the brainstem. So here you are able to see a mid-sagittal section of the whole brain, which consists of the cerebrum. Okay, and here you are able to see a space which is covered by a septum, and deep to that is the lateral ventricle. Immediately below the cerebrum, so this we call it as a cerebral cortex. Below the cerebrum, what we see is the thalamus, which is a sensory relay center. It is a part of diencephalon. This is the telencephalon, and that is your corpus callosum, which connects the two cerebral hemispheres. It is actually a white matter. It is a part of commissural white matter. Okay, then as you come down, this is your brain stem. Mainly what you see here is the midbrain, and then pons. Below the pons, what you see is the medulla. Posterior to the midbrain, pons and medulla, what you see is the cerebellum. Okay, so this is actually called as the cerebellum. So I have just given a very brief idea about the parts on the medial aspect. Then you are able to see a narrow passage here that is called as the cerebral aqueduct, which is um the cavity of the midbrain. Then here, what you are able to see here is the fourth ventricle. So the cavity which is shared between the components of the hindbrain. So fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, and deep to this membrane you see the what you call as the lateral ventricle. Now here thalamus, exactly in the midline you see one more ventricle here, that is the third ventricle. So now you are seeing only the lateral wall of the third ventricle formed by the thalamus and hypothalamus. Okay. So if you take a section, you won't be able to see the cavity of the third ventricle. So now, as I told you, the brain stem comprises of midbrain, pons and medulla. So this actually connects your forebrain with the spinal cord. Okay, so connects the forebrain with the spinal cord. That is that is why it is called as the brain stem. Now, your cranial nerve nuclei, 3rd to 12th cranial nerve nuclei are situated in the brain stem from above downwards. Okay, so the oculomotor and trochlear in the midbrain. Then you have your 5, 6 and 7. So that is your trigeminal, abducens and your facial nerve. Okay, then 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All these are in the medulla, especially the 9, 10, 11, 12. Whereas the 8th and is considered to be at the junction of the pons and medulla, vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, so this is actually a view of the brainstem you are able to see here. The emergence of the cranial nerves are also you are able to see here. So that is the second cranial nerve, optic chiasma, forming the optic tract. That is not concerned with the brainstem. It goes directly to the cerebral cortex. Okay. So anterior part of the midbrain you are able to see as the crus cerebri or the cerebral peduncles. And what is emerging from the medial side of the cerebral peduncles is your third cranial or oculomotor nerve. And that space is called as the interpeduncular fossa. So all these we will come later. This is the pons you are able to see here below the midbrain, and that is the groove called as the basilar groove where the basilar artery is lodged. The pons nerves emerging are the main, the fifth cranial nerve you are able to see, the trigeminal nerve. So you might wonder where is the trochlear nerve. Trochlear nerve is the only nerve emerging from the dorsal aspect of the brain, from the brain stem. So here you are able to see this slender nerve is actually the trochlear nerve from posterior aspect, then it winds laterally and comes to the front. Then almost near to the midline, paramedian in position is your abducens nerve, and then more laterally you are able to see the facial nerve, and that is your vestibulocochlear nerve consisting of vestibular and the cochlear component. Then this rootlets you are able to see is the 12th cranial nerve, hypoglossal nerve, and more behind in line is your 9th, 10th and 11th, glossopharyngeal, vagus, and then the accessory nerve. Okay, so these are the cranial nerves emerging from the brainstem. So this is your midbrain, pons and medulla. This is the lateral view. The above part, bulged part, is actually the large sensory relay center, that is your thalamus. Okay. Now this brainstem also has connections with the cerebellum, which is here behind by three peduncles. The superior cerebellar peduncle, which connects from the midbrain to the cerebellum. Then you have the massive, very large peduncle, the middle cerebellar peduncle from the pons to the cerebellum. And then you have the inferior cerebellar peduncle which connects the midbrain to the cerebellum. Okay, so three cerebellar peduncles, sorry, whereas cerebral peduncle is only one which forms your anterior part of your midbrain. Okay, so apart from this the cranial nerve nuclei, there are other nuclei also which is present in the brainstem. So that we will see. For example, you also have the red nucleus in the midbrain, which is a uh, gray matter, and then you also have substantia nigra. Then you have pontine nuclei. In the midbrain also you have displaced pontine nuclei called as the arcuate nuclei. The nuclei of reticular formation. So like this, other nuclei are also present. Okay, and then your medulla has your vital centers, mainly your respiratory center and cardiac center, and then you also have the reticular activating system. So the reticular formation is a very complex network of fibers and nuclei situated along the length of the brainstem. Okay, especially you can see it in the pons and the medulla, which is called as the reticular activating system. So this is mainly concerned with your consciousness. So that is why what happens is even when we sleep, so your higher centers might actually become put to rest, whereas the lower centers, your reticular activating system, especially your lower spinal centers, are always in a state of wakefulness. So that is why this is always acting. So you respire, your heart works, even when you sleep, your bladder gets what you call filled. Okay, so mainly the lower centers are which are called as the present in the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the cranial nerve nuclei are present as I told you, and your other part which I told you is your red nucleus, and they are all part of your extrapyramidal system. And then you have a visual and auditory relay center in the midbrain, okay, at the level of superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. So I'm just introducing certain terms, but we will be discussing in detail. Okay, so only now for this time being, you remember mainly it consists of cranial nerve nuclei and some other nucleus which we will be discussing in detail at the sections at various levels. Now, Coming to the medulla oblongata, which you are able to see here. So it is 3 centimeters in length, okay, and at the upper part it is 2 centimeters wide. Upper part is wide and the lower part is somewhat narrow, and it is also called as the bulb because it is somewhat bulb shaped. Uh, so that is why it is actually also called as the bulb, and lower part of your brainstem. So midbrain, pons, and then lower part of the brainstem is the medulla. So the medulla continues downwards as the spinal cord, okay, from the upper border of the C1 vertebra. So it is a part of your hindbrain vesicle, rhombencephalon. So naturally, the parts which are developed from the rhombencephalon are your medulla, pons, and then the cerebellum, which you are able to see behind. Okay, so pons, medulla, and cerebellum are actually developed from the rhombencephalon, and they share the cavity with them. Within them is the fourth ventricle. And you know, from the fourth ventricle only, the CSF secreted in the ventricles escapes into the subarachnoid space via the opening in the roof of the fourth ventricle, which is called as the foramen of Magendie and foramen of Lishka. So, as I told you, the upper border of the atlas or the first cervical vertebra, the medulla continues as the spinal cord, and mainly the last four cranial nerves. So, you are able to see the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve anteriorly, you are able to see, and then more behind, you are able to see the ninth, 10th, and the 11th cranial nerves. They arise from that order below, above, downwards. Okay, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and then your 11th cranial nerve, that is your accessory nerve. Okay, so now coming to the external features, um, most of the features they resemble that of the spinal cord. So anterior median fissure you are able to see, which we also saw in the spinal cord, the same fissure, anterior median fissure, which you are able to appreciate in the anterior or ventral aspect of the medulla. Okay, so and then you also see posterior lateral sulcus only in the behind, posterior median sulcus, that we will see in the posterior aspect in the next slide. So on either side of the anterior median fissure, you are able to see the anterolateral sulcus. So same like in the spinal cord, you are also able to see the anterolateral sulcus. In the spinal cord, the ventral nerve roots, mainly your efferent motor nerve roots, ventral nerve roots of the spinal cord, they arise. But here you are able to see the hypoglossal nerve arises from the anterior lateral sulcus. Okay, they are the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve. And then posterolateral sulcus. So there posterolateral sulcus in the spinal cord, the dorsal nerve roots they arise. But here uh, actually you are able to see the along the posterolateral sulcus, that is your ninth, 10th, and the 11th cranial nerves, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then you have the vagus nerve, the rootlets of the vagus nerve, and then your accessory nerve. So mainly the spinal part of the accessory nerve, they arise from the posterolateral sulcus. Then if you trace the anterior median fissure above, it ends as a small foramen, which is actually called as the foramen cecum. So on the ventral aspect, mainly what you come across the origin of the 11th, 12th cranial nerve from the anterolateral sulcus. And the lowermost part of medulla, you can see there are crossing of fibers. It is taking place more deeply, but superficially a few fibers you can see that represents the superficial part of the crossing of the pyramidal fibers of the corticospinal tract, which is called as the pyramidal decussation. Pyramidal decussation occurs at a deeper level, but certain fibers you are able to see that are also seen anteriorly. So continuing with the external features on the anterior aspect, so On either side you see an elevation in the lower part which is actually called as the pyramids. So the elevation on either side is actually called as the pyramids. So these pyramids are mainly made up of the descending tracts. They are the corticospinal tract, the main motor tract. So definitely the pyramids are collection of white matter or fibers. Okay, so corticospinal tract, at still lower level you go, they only after that these fibers they uh, decussate, that is they cross and move to the opposite side, which forms your lateral corticospinal tract. And the uncrossed fibers, of course, 75% of the fibers they cross. Few uncrossed fibers they continue as the anterior corticospinal tract. So all this is going to take place at a lower level. Okay, so just above that you see these elevations which are called as the pyramids. Okay, so then next you are able to see certain fibers called as the anterior external arcuate fibers. So these fibers they are from the displaced pontine nuclei called as the arcuate nuclei. So the fibers they wind laterally and move to the opposite cerebellar peduncles. Anterior external arcuate fibers. They are from the arcuate nuclei which is displaced pontine nuclei. So all these we will come as we deal with the sections at various levels. And then upper part of the medulla you are able to see these swellings. They are actually called as the olives. Okay, more laterally you are able to see that is actually called as the olives. So the pyramids are able to see on either side of the anterior median sulcus. Then lateral, you see the anterior lateral sulcus. Lateral to the anterior lateral sulcus, you see these swellings which are actually called as the olives. So deep to the olives, you have a nucleus which is called as the olivary nucleus, and it is actually called as the olivary nuclear complex because it is a combination of 2 to 3 nucleus, and of which the largest of these olivary nuclear complex is the inferior olivary nucleus. Okay, so that produces a bulging on the surface which is called as the olives, and it is seen lateral to the anterolateral sulcus or between the anterolateral and the posterolateral sulcus. Okay, and more laterally behind the olives, what you see is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is diverges laterally. So a specimen of the human medulla oblongata, which you are able to see here. So that is the pons, and that is the anterior part of the midbrain called as the cerebral peduncles. So pons laterally, what you are able to see is the thick middle cerebellar peduncles. So medulla anterior median fissure. Okay, and these swellings are called as the pyramids. Then anterior lateral sulcus. Lateral to the sulcus, what you see is the olives. These elevations are actually called as the olives. And more laterally, what you are able to see, that is the inferior cerebellar peduncles. From the posterolateral sulcus, you are able to see the cranial nerve 9, 10 and 11 emerging. So here, between the pyramids and olives, the 12th nerve will emerge, rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve. Now, coming to the dorsal aspect, so in this diagram, you are able to see the dorsal aspect, the posterior median sulcus, which you are able to see here. And on either side, you see two elevations, which is produced by again a band of white matter, which is called as the medial one is the fasciculus gracilis, and lateral one is actually called as the fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. So they are ascending tracks which are mainly concerned with your tactile discrimination, discriminative touch and joint vibration. Okay, discriminative touch, mainly concerned with the 2-point tactile discrimination, joint sense and vibratory sense. So if you trace these white matter above, they end in a swelling which is called as the gracile and cuneate tubercles. Okay, so deep to the tubercles you have the nuclei of this white matter, that is the gracile and cuneate nucleus. Okay, so they end in an elevation called as the gracile and cuneate tubercles. Okay, so deep to that tubercle you have the nucleus where these white matter, that is the ascending tract, fasciculus, gracilis and cuneate will go and relay. Okay, then what you have lateral to that, you see an other elevation which is called as the tuberculum cinereum. So tuberculum cinereum is different from tuber cinereum. Tuber cinereum we see in the base of the brain. Okay, so this is called as tuberculum cinereum, which is an elevation formed by the spinal tract of trigeminal nerve. So trigeminal nerve, it actually originates from the pons, which has the principal sensory nucleus and the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. But in the medulla, lower part of the medulla, you have spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. Same way, one more nucleus is present in the midbrain, which is called as the mesencephalic nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So actually trigeminal nerve has got three nucleus extending along the brainstem. Okay, so that is actually the tuberculum cinereum. Then the upper part of the dorsal aspect, it is closed here, but upper part it is open because of the diverging inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, you are able to see that inferior cerebellar peduncles. So this part forms the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. So these features you are actually seeing in the floor of the fourth ventricle. So the dorsal aspect, you are able to see the posterior median sulcus, and that is your gracile tubercle and the cuneate tubercles. These are the diverging inferior cerebellar peduncles, and in between the diverging peduncles, you see the lower part of the roof. This is the upper part of the roof, which is formed by the dorsal aspect of the pons. So the dorsal aspect of the medulla, upper part of the medulla, forms the lower part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. So other as features dorsally, what you come across is the, as I told you, the inferior cerebellar peduncles, which are actually diverging. So that is the cerebellum you are able to see here. One half of the cerebellum has been removed. So in between the diverging peduncles, what you are able to see here is the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. And here you are able to see two trigones. One is the hypoglossal trigone and other one is the vagal trigone. Okay, so deep to it you have the hypoglossal nucleus and the vagal nucleus. So they are called as trigones or triangles. Okay, and then one more band of fibers you are able to see. This is called as the stria medullaris. Okay, so this is again fibers from the arcuate nuclei only. They travel posteriorly. So we saw some anterior external arcuate fibers. So the other route for the arcuate nuclei is through the stria medullaris. They go to the opposite inferior cerebellar peduncle, and from there they reach the cerebellum, which is called as the stria medullaris. This whole thing forms the floor of the fourth ventricle, which is called as the rhomboid fossa because it is rhomboid in shape. And the rhomboid is actually a combination of two triangles. Okay, so they are actually combination of two triangles. The lower triangle is mainly formed by the medulla, which consists of the your hypoglossal trigone and vagal trigone. So other features we will be discussing again in the floor of the fourth ventricle. So when we actually discuss the fourth ventricle, so these floor features in detail we will be discussing. So next, coming to the internal features of the medulla oblongata. So the internal features are actually studied at three levels, taking a cross section or horizontal section or three levels. The first section at the level of pyramidal decussation, which passes to the lower part of the medulla. So we will be actually taking a section here and then reviewing the internal structures. Then little high above, you take a section which will actually pass through the up middle part where one more decussation takes place, that is the sensory decussation. Okay, so then followed by that upper part of the medulla, you take a section and that passes through the olives. So the medulla is actually sectioned at three levels to understand the internal features. So before passing on to the uh, what do you call internal features, I just thought I will have a quick revision of again the tracks of the spinal cord, because all the tracks which we have seen in the spinal cord is going to continue. So you're able to see that is the dorsal horn and the ventral horn, gray matter, and then this is your central canal forming your central gray matter. Okay, so that is the white matter which can be divided into three columns. This is actually the ventral column, and that is the dorsal column, and sorry, the lateral column, and behind what you see is the dorsal column for each half of the spinal cord. So ascending tracts, already I have mentioned. So this is the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, which we have seen in the medulla, and that forms a bulge in the upper part, posterior aspect as gracile and cuneate tubercles, because it is going to end in a nucleus called as the gracile and cuneate nucleus. Then in the lateral column, mainly what you are able to see here is the anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. So this is going to enter the cerebellum. So this you will see in the medulla again, but it will not be visible in the higher levels, because from there it enters the cerebellum. Anterior and posterior, or we call it as dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts, concerned with proprioception, muscle sensation. Then you have the lateral spinothalamic tract. This is mainly concerned with the pain and temperature sensations. So the lateral is, because you call it as lateral, because the fibers as they enter through the dorsal root, the pain and temperature fibers, they cross to the opposite side as lateral spinothalamic tract. Okay, you also have in the ventral column one anterior spinothalamic tract. Anterior spinothalamic tract is present. So this anterior spinothalamic tract is concerned with the crude touch and pressure sensations. Okay, so these are the major ascending tracts. Now coming to the descending tracts, as I told you, major tract is the lateral corticospinal tract. Descending means they are actually coming from the higher center, cerebral cortex. Mostly it is from the cerebral cortex. So lateral corticospinal tract, and the ventral part you have the ventral. So they usually, what happens, up to the lower part of the medulla, they are the corticospinal tract, and in the lower part of the medulla they decussate, and the crossed fibers from the lateral corticospinal tract and the uncrossed fibers from the ventral corticospinal tract. Okay, so these are mainly concerned with the muscle movements. Okay, so total paralysis of the muscle occurs if this tract is damaged or cut. Okay, so that is about the lateral corticospinal tract. Then you see the rubrospinal tract, which arises from the midbrain, red nucleus. It goes to the spinal cord. Okay, so this mainly function of this is to facilitate the movement of flexors and inhibit the extensors. Facilitatory to the flexors and inhibitory to the extensors. Okay, so apart from the corticospinal tract, which I just mentioned, the remaining all tracts, they form the extrapyramidal system. Okay, so this rubrospinal and the following tracts which I am going to mention forms the extrapyramidal system. So the extrapyramidal system function is to coordinate smooth movement of the muscles and also maintenance of muscle tone. Okay, so smooth movement. So as I told you, see, this is facilitating the flexors and inhibiting the extensor. So that means when a flexor action is going to take place, the extensors should be inhibited from acting. So thereby this is coordination of the muscle movement. Okay, so that is one tract. Then you also see one more tract in the anterior column, the vestibulospinal tract. So you have medial and lateral vestibulo spinal tract. So they mainly arise from the vestibular nucleus. You have the medial and lateral vestibular nucleus. The medial vestibular nucleus is main efferent pathway for equilibrium. So from the vestibular apparatus in the internal ear, which we have discussed in detail. So you have the macula cells. Okay, okay, inside the semicircular canals, you have crista, ampullaris, and then the macular cells. So from there, the vestibular fibers, they arise and they actually relay in the vestibular nucleus, and from there they continue as the vestibulospinal tract. So mainly for maintenance of equilibrium. You also have that is the medial vestibulospinal forms the main afferent pathway. The lateral vestibulospinal tract forms the main efferent pathway. Sorry, just a small confusion. The lateral vestibulospinal forms the main efferent pathway for the equilibrium. And not only that, they are facilitatory to extensor muscles. They are facilitatory to extensor muscles of the back, neck, and limbs, and inhibitory to the flexor muscles. So here it is a bit, if you think a bit naturally, you can understand why they are facilitatory to extensor muscles. That means extensors help us to maintain the erect posture. So flexor muscles, when you bend, you fall down because the center of gravity always tries to push you down. So that is why for maintenance of equilibrium. Then you also have an olivospinal tract. So the olivospinal tract arises from the inferior olivary nucleus. Okay, olivospinal tract. It's a very small tract. Then you have reticulospinal tract. So medial and lateral reticulospinal tract. So here you are able to see the medial reticulospinal tract, and here you are able to see the lateral reticulospinal tract. So the medial reticulospinal tract, it arises from the reticular formation of the pons, and they are actually facilitatory again to the extensor muscles of the trunk and limbs, but they are inhibitory to their neck muscles. So mainly concerned with again postural adjustment of your head, trunk, and limbs with respect to your position or equilibrium. Then the lateral reticulospinal tract. This is facilitated to the flexors of the trunk and limbs, and this mainly arises from the lateral reticular nucleus, which is situated in the medulla. Okay, so they are also concerned with the transmission of pain through the ascending tracts. And not only that, the lateral reticulospinal tract is also responsible for automatic breathing, which is controlled by this lateral reticulospinal tract. So that is about the reticulospinal tract, and then the vestibulospinal, rubrospinal, and you also have a descending autonomic fibers. Okay, so the descending autonomic fibers are called as hypothalamo-spinal fibers. They start from there. Okay, so you have the descending autonomic fibers. So with this brief explanation about the tracts, we will move on to the section of the spinal cord. So mainly you are able to see section of medulla at the level of pyramidal decussation. So if you take a section, it is resembling more of your spinal cord, the outline and shape. So in the middle, what you see is the central canal, and the gray matter around that is actually called as the central gray matter, as such in the spinal cord what we have seen. Now, if you look the central gray matter dorsally, it shows a tongue-like projection, and that is called as the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. The medial one is the nucleus gracilis and lateral one is the nucleus cuneatus. So they form a bulge as the gracile and the cuneate tubercles on the surface, which we have seen on the external aspect. Then, so that is the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus. Posterior to the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, you have the tract of this fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. So these fibers, fasciculus gracile and cuneatus, will be relaying into this nucleus. So that is why they are named of the same name. Okay. So then more laterally, you are able to see the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve, and then you have the tract. So the white matter, the tract of the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So this nucleus mainly receives efferent fibers. Sorry, afferent fibers. These mainly receives afferent fibers, sensations from your face and mucous membrane of your nose and mouth. So the principal nucleus which you will be seeing in the pons, principal nucleus of trigeminal nerve, and the spinal nucleus will mainly receive the sensations, general sensations from your, as I told you, from your face. Okay, trigeminal nerve is involved with the cutaneous innervation of the face and also sensations from the mucous membrane of your oral cavity and the nose. Whereas one more nucleus I told you, that is the mesencephalic nucleus of trigeminal nerve, which is situated in the midbrain, and that is concerned with receiving proprioceptive impulses from your muscles of mastication, proprioceptive impulses from the muscles of mastication, and also from the extraocular muscles, proprioceptive impulses from your extraocular muscles. Okay. Then you are able to see the ventral gray horn. So the ventral gray horn, what happens is actually interfered or cut by these fibers which are crossing, which is called as the pyramidal decussation. So what arises from the ventral gray horn is your C1 nerve fiber, C1 first cervical nerve, because we are at the lowermost part of the medulla, and the spinal accessory nerve. Okay, so from the ventral gray horn, the spinal accessory nerve, which is going to innervate your sternomastoid and the trapezius muscle. So now you're able to see the spinal cord and the lowermost part of the spinal cord where this crossing is taking place, the great pyramidal decussation. Above that section of the spinal cord, this is the upper part of the spinal cord where you see a solid mass which is called as the pyramids, the fibers of the corticospinal tract. So these fibers, they cross at the lower part of the medulla, which is forming your pyramidal decussation. So mainly the corticospinal fibers, they cross and forms the lateral corticospinal tract. You are able to see these fibers have crossed to the opposite side as lateral corticospinal tract, and the uncrossed fibers, some fibers, they don't cross at all and pass as the anterior corticospinal tract. So the crossed fibers which forms the pyramidal decussation forms the lateral corticospinal tract, which is the 75% of the fibers they cross. The remaining 25% pass as uncrossed anterior corticospinal tract. Okay, so that crossing separates your ventral horn from the central gray matter. Okay, and then the section what you are able to see here. So this is a very diagrammatic representation of the section of the medulla. So the ventral gray horn from the central gray matter is separated by this. What you are able to see is the great pyramidal decussation, and posteriorly that is the nucleus gracilis and the cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. So this is the nucleus of spinal trigeminal nerve and tract of the trigeminal nerve, spinal nucleus and spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, and then reticular formation you are able to see here lateral to the ventral horn, which consists of your medial and lateral reticular nucleus. Okay, so I just described what is the function of medial and lateral reticular nucleus, and then more laterally you see your olivospinal, rubrospinal, tectospinal tracts. So that is your olivospinal, vestibulospinal and rubrospinal tract. More lateral, they occupy the same position as that of the spinal cord. Okay, there not much change is there. And then you're able to see anterior and posterior spinocerebellar and the spinothalamic tracts. So spinocerebellar and spino ascending tracts are also you are able to see there. Nothing much difference. Mainly you see the nucleus of this and the crossing of the pyramidal fibers. Okay. Next, coming to the section of medulla at the level of the sensory decussation. So you go a little bit higher. What happens is you see the level of sensory decussation. One more decussation is going to takes place. So this is at the above the level of pyramidal decussation. So that is why now you are able to see the pyramids as a solid mass of white matter. The corticospinal tract, they have not yet crossed. Only below they are going to cross, which we have seen just uh, in the last slide. Okay, now what happens is the nucleus gracilis and the cuneatus. So that is the nucleus gracilis and the cuneatus. You are able to see here. They are now much enlarged and more prominent. You are able to see. Now the fibers from the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus pass around the central gray matter, and these fibers are actually called as the internal arcuate fibers. You're able to see they are the internal arcuate fibers. So fibers arising from the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus are called as the internal arcuate fibers. We have already seen what is external arcuate fibers. They are from the arcuate nuclei. So this is more important, internal arcuate fiber. The more medial fibers you see, they come to lie more anteriorly, and the more lateral fibers they come to lie posteriorly. So more medial fibers come to lie anteriorly, and the more lateral fibers they go to lie posteriorly. And from anterior to posterior, if you see, the anterior fibers constitute the fibers which are from the limb, okay, especially from the lower limb. Okay, the lower limb. Okay, and then you have trunk, upper limb and face. It goes like that from anterior to posterior. So you know they are carrying tactile discriminatory sense. Now these fibers, I told you, they cross to the opposite side, and after that they are called as medial lemniscus. They are actually called as the medial lemniscus. So what are medial lemniscus? They are the crossed internal arcuate fibers. The medial lemniscus is the crossed internal arcuate fibers which are arising from the nucleus gracilis and the cuneatus. And the fibers for the lower limb are present anteriorly, and whereas the upper limb and face are actually present posteriorly. Okay, so that is about the sensory decussation. Okay, so as I told you, the most medial fibers from the leg lie anteriorly, followed by trunk and upper limb. Other features, what you see at the level of sensory decussation, accessory cuneate nucleus. So lateral to the cuneate nucleus, you also see the accessory cuneate nucleus. So fibers from the posterior external arcuate fibers. Okay, so they form the posterior external arcuate fibers. And then in the central gray matter, so many nuclei you are able to see, especially anteriorly on either side of the midline, anterior to the central canal, you see the hypoglossal nucleus. Okay, paramedian in position, and the fibers they emerge to the anterolateral sulcus. You see the hypoglossal nucleus. Then more laterally you see the dorsal nucleus of vagus nerve. Dorsal motor nucleus. Lateral to the hypoglossal nucleus, you have the dorsal nucleus of vagus nerve. Okay, and then more laterally you see the nucleus of tractus solitarius. Okay, so that is the nucleus of tractus solitarius. So that is mainly concerned with your taste. Nucleus of tractus solitarius. So here you are able to see the nucleus of tractus solitarius, which gives fibers mainly to your ninth nerve, 10th nerve and 7th nerve. So 7th nerve you have a gustatory part which is actually that is a geniculate ganglion seen in the facial canal. Okay, so cauda tympanic nerve which carries taste sensations to the anterior two-third of the tongue, and then this glossopharyngeal nerve. So again posterior one-third of the tongue, taste sensations. It receives fibers, and apart from that it also has other components. No baroreceptor component mainly, which is going to innervate your carotid body. Okay, and then so you have 7th, 9th and 10th nerve, vagus nerve. So vagus nerve also has got the valvular part of the tongue, so which is concerned with the taste. So mainly you are able to see that is your nucleus of tractus solitarius. One is the gustatory component, another one is the respiratory and baroreceptor. Okay, which is to the mainly supplying your 9th and the 10th nerve. And then you have commissural nucleus, which is again a part of vagus only. So the dorsal nucleus of the vagus joins with the gustatory nucleus, forming your commissural nucleus. Then one more nucleus more anteriorly, you see the nucleus ambiguous. So you see the nucleus ambiguous. So the function is not known, that is why they have kept it as nucleus ambiguous. Seen in the reticular formation more ventrally. okay, more ventral to the nucleus of tractus solitarius. So they mainly send fibers to your you are able to see here the 9th, 10th and the 11th nerve, glossopharyngeal, vagus, and then your cranial part of accessory nerve, 11th nerve, cranial part of accessory nerve, 9th nerve and 10th nerve. So they are mainly responsible for innervating uh, your pharyngeal muscles through the pharyngeal plexus, laryngeal muscles, again all the muscles of the larynx, even though it is supplied by the recurrent laryngeal nerve of the vagus, it is the fibers of the cranial part of accessory nerve travel to that. Okay, so spinal and cranial part, you are able to see the cranial part of accessory nerve actually traveling via the vagus nerve. So that is the function of nucleus ambiguous, send fibers to your 9th, 10th and 11th, mainly innervating your pharyngeal and the laryngeal muscles. So hypoglossal nucleus we have seen, then we have seen nucleus of tractus solitarius, dorsal nucleus of vagus and nucleus ambiguous. So pyramids are actually seen in the ventral part, so they form the bulk of the corticospinal tract, and then more anteriorly you will see a small arcuate nucleus. Okay, more arcuate nucleus, you can see that, and then spinal nucleus and tract of trigeminal nerve, anterior and posterior spinocerebellar and spinothalamic tract, all those are seen in their respective positions. Okay, then remaining this part and the other things I will show you or discuss in the next section. Okay, then small part of inferior olivary nucleus is also seen. Lower part of your inferior olivary nucleus is seen laterally. Okay, and you also see the accessory olivary nucleus. Yes. Now coming to the section of medulla at the level of olives. This is when you take a section at the level of the swelling upper part of the medulla and the olives. So main thing you are able to see a large accessory inferior olivary nucleus. So it is of a crumpled bag which opens medially. So these inferior olivary nucleus mainly receives afferents from your cerebral cortex and the spinal cord, spino-olivary tract. The efferents go to the cerebellum as the olivocerebellar fibers. Okay, so go to the cerebellum as the olivocerebellar fibers. So we'll come to it later. Before that, what are the other aspects? You're able to see now the dorsal aspect has expanded upper part of the medulla, forming the floor of the fourth ventricle. So what you see on the floor, so on the fourth ventricle, you are able to see the nucleus of vagus that forms the vagal trigone, which we have seen on the surface. And more laterally, what you see is the vestibular nucleus. Okay, so you have the vestibular nucleus. So medially hypoglossal, then more laterally you have the vagal nucleus, and then you have the vestibular nucleus from medial to lateral. Okay, and then you have the nucleus of tractus solitarius. Okay, nucleus of tractus solitarius ambiguous, all continuing. So in the reticular formation, you will have the nucleus ambiguous. Then inferior cerebellar peduncles. Now we are able to see the diverging peduncles, the inferior, massive inferior cerebellar peduncles, and associated with this inferior cerebellar peduncle is your cochlear nucleus. So you will come across on the surface inferior cerebellar peduncles, cochlear nucleus, and more anteriorly you see the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So cochlear nucleus are seen in relation to the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So you are able to see the section. So mainly the floor of the fourth ventricle, on the surface of the floor, hypoglossal nerve nucleus, hypoglossal nerve emerging, and then you are able to see that is lateral to the hypoglossal nucleus, the vagus nucleus, the vagal nucleus, which you are able to see here. And more laterally, you are able to see uh, that is your vestibular nucleus. Okay, vestibular nucleus in relation to the what do you call that is your uh, inferior cerebellar peduncle. So in relation to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, you will see the cochlear nucleus. You will see the cochlear nucleus, and the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. The spinal nucleus and tract of the trigeminal nerve is actually the upward continuation of substantia gelatinosa. Okay, substantia gelatinosa. Then in the midline, when we trace medial to lateral, now you trace it anteriorly. So hypoglossal nerve nucleus, and then you have the tectospinal tract, medial longitudinal fasciculus. You are able to see, and then you have the medial lemniscus. Okay, so medial longitudinal fasciculus, tectospinal tract, and then the medial lemniscus. You know what is this medial lemniscus? This is actually the crossed internal arcuate fibers from the sensory decussation. Okay, so what is actually medial longitudinal fasciculus? So the medial longitudinal fasciculus is again the white matter which connects third, fourth, and sixth nerve to the eighth nerve, that is the vestibular nucleus. You're able to understand. Third, fourth, and sixth are mainly innervating your extraocular muscles. This is vestibular nucleus. So there should be a coordination between your balance and your eye movements. So that is why the main function of the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Tectospinal tract also merges with the what do you call the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Tectospinal tract arises from the tectum of midbrain, superior colliculus, and ends in the spinal cord. They are concerned with the visual spinal reflexes. Okay, tectospinal tract. Okay, so mainly movement of the neck muscles in response to eye movement and position of the head. So that is the main function of the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which you are able to see here. Then inferior olivary nucleus, as you are able to see, large crumpled bag seen lateral to the medial lemniscus. Okay, so mainly I told you it receives fibers from the cerebral cortex and spinal cord afferents. Efferents go to the cerebellum where the olivocerebellar fibers, and accessory olivary nucleus also sends fibers to the cerebellum via the parvocerebellar fibers. So afferents from cerebrum and spinal cord, efferents to cerebellum via the olivocerebellar tract. So we have completed the section at the three levels of the medulla oblongata. So blood supply mainly vertebral artery unites to form the anterior spinal artery. So branches from anterior spinal artery, and then posteriorly again from the vertebral artery, posterior spinal artery. Okay, then apart from that we have two other arteries. One is actually the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Okay, anterior spinal artery mainly supplies the anteromedial aspect. Posterior spinal artery supplies the area including the gracile and cuneate nucleus. Posterior inferior cerebellar artery, very important artery, pica, because dorsolateral area. So all the nuclear part, hypoglossal nucleus, vestibular nucleus, and your nucleus ambiguous, nucleus troctus solitarius, all that area behind the olives is actually supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Then one more artery, you have the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So, and also you have direct bulbar or medullary branches from the vertebral artery. So that is about the blood supply of this medulla oblongata. Coming to clinical aspects, two syndromes, vascular syndromes. One is actually the lateral medullary syndrome of Wallenberg. So when your pica, posterior inferior cerebellar arteries thrombosed or blocked, then all these area will get affected. So what will be the symptoms? Contralateral loss of pain and temperature pathway because of the lateral spinothalamic tract. Okay, so the lateral spinothalamic tract fibers are affected. The lateral spinothalamic tract fibers will be present here anterior to the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Then ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature in face because spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. Okay, so the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve is affected. Then dysphagia dysarthria because of nucleus ambiguous, which is situated in the reticular formation. Okay, so then ataxia and giddiness because of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So these are the major symptoms which you come across in a lateral medullary syndrome. So inferior cerebellar peduncle, and as I told you, mainly the nucleus which is affected. Nucleus ambiguous and dysphagia and dysarthria, ataxia and giddiness, and then ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature sensation only in the face. Okay, and then contralateral loss of pain because of the crossed fibers, lateral spinothalamic tract. And you also have Horner's syndrome because of the descending autonomic fibers. Next is the medial medullary syndrome. So this is mainly to the anterior inferior cerebellar or vertebral artery, mainly the branches of the vertebral artery, thrombosis of the anterior spinal artery. Symptoms is hypoglossal nucleus is affected. Okay, then hemiplegia because pyramids are affected. So ipsilateral deviation of tongue because of hypoglossal nerve. Contralateral hemiplegia because after this the corticospinal tract is going to cross. So contralateral hemiplegia. Then contralateral loss of discriminative touch. So nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, medial lemniscus, no, from that fibers. So the medial lemniscus will be affected, hypoglossal nerve. So anteriorly on either side of the midline, those structures. Okay, hypoglossal nerve, medial lemniscus and pyramids. Then what is bulbar palsy is again nothing but a palsy of the medulla as a whole. Medulla is also called as bulbar palsy. So symptoms include difficulty in swallowing, breathing, dysphagia, dysarthria, dysphonia, not able to produce sounds. Pseudobulbar palsy is motor neuron disease. So it will affect all the cranial nerve nuclei. So you get lower motor neuron paralysis. Again, you will have dysarthria, the dysphagia in case of the pseudobulbar palsy. So here it mimics like a palsy of the medulla, but it is actually a lower motor neuron disease. So with that, I have completed the medulla oblongata, and thank you very much for your patient listening.